Hey, Stacey, it's so awesome to be here with you. Thanks for doing this. Um, so I guess my first question to you as an entrepreneur is, what's your elevator pitch? I mean, how would you describe Stacey Abrams in 1 minute?
I can do less time than that. So I am a political leader, a justice advocate, an author, an entrepreneur, tax attorney, and an avid consumer of all things, fiction. But I would also add that I am an active purveyor and believer in work-life Jenga, because work-life balance is a lie. And I am excellent at picking up the pieces and putting them back together.
Awesome. That sounds very entrepreneurial. So when did you first begin to think of yourself as an entrepreneur? And if someone were to ask you, because some people might be like, oh, she's a politician, what are your entrepreneurial bona fides? I think that you've created like 6 or 7 organizations, raised lots of money, but help everyone else to understand all the stuff that you've done.
So I created my first organization actually during when we were in law school together. I started a nonprofit organization because I was helping small organizations in the American South. Usually they were serving disadvantaged communities. I was consulting and giving them aid, and they kept trying to pay me. I didn't want to take their money because I knew these were organizations that didn't have the resources because I was doing that work. But my parents actually reminded me that these were proud people and they didn't want charity, they wanted service. And that when people want to pay you for your services, you should let them. I believe that, but I'd also been raised by these same two people to do what you can to help others. So my compromise was that I started an organization called Third Sector Development. It was a 501c3 organization, and while I accepted fees for the work I did, I then used those dollars to pay for things like applications to the IRS for 501c3 status, or to provide access to a copy machine or things like that. So I basically retooled the money and funneled it into services, but it was my way of situating both being a service provider and being someone who believed in supporting organizations. So I did that in 1998. And then when I ran for office in 2006, I was deputy city attorney for Atlanta. My job then was to serve the city, and I didn't think it was appropriate to be a lawyer for the city and be in state office if I'd been elected. And so when I was elected, actually, I stepped down before I ran and had to figure out a way to stay in my house while I was in in the middle of a campaign. So I started my first consulting firm that was purely for profit. That was called Sage Works Consulting. And I had clients who had gotten to know me when I was at the city. And that became my first real bona fide, I live off of the money I make doing this work. That was really awkward for me. I did not think of myself as an entrepreneur. I did not want to be an entrepreneur. I like paychecks, but my situation demanded that if I wanted to pursue the multi-strands of my identity, if I wanted to run for office and continue to make a living, I had to do both. After that, I started another consulting firm that focused on infrastructure projects with my business partner, Laura Hodgson. She and I started Insomnia Consulting. We did a lot of work with major corporations like CB Richard Ellis and others, helping them do infrastructure directed programs. The challenge there was that the economy collapsed and they no longer needed to buy up land or do major projects in that way. We then started Nourish, which was a bottled water for babies and toddlers. We actually grew that company to a pretty sizable level. We were still doing hand tooling and hand filling, which if you do water, if you've ever thought about the water business, you really want it to be automated. And the challenge we had was that we grew so effectively, we were able to do a test with Whole Foods, and they bought, they wanted to place an order. Laura came in all excited about the order, and I, being the COO, had to disappoint her and say, we can't meet this order unless we can find the money to automate our equipment. We went out into the marketplace, could not find the resources, which is something every entrepreneur knows about. We went to the marketplace. This was in the middle of the credit crunch, and so we were denied by banks and then by credit unions. We finally ended up with a factoring company. We got all the way through their process, and then at the last leg of the process, we fell out of their credit qualification scores, and so we didn't get the money. So we had to shut down Nourish. But one of the factoring bankers came to us and said, I have the solution to this problem. And I'd love to talk to you too about it through your consulting firm. So we brought him on as a client, and we created Now Corp, which is a fintech company we started. Our major product is called Now Account. We buy invoices from small businesses for B2B transactions. We will give you pretty much the face value of that invoice with a holdback for our cost. And we basically monetize invoices for small businesses so that they're not waiting on a net 30 invoice to be paid in 120 days. And so Now Account is the most thriving of the businesses I've started. And then corollary to that, in 2014, I launched the New Georgia Project, which is the single largest voter registration effort in the state of Georgia. I created Fair Fight, which is one of the largest democracy organizations in the United States. I created Fair Count, which is an organization focused on the census. It's a 501c3. And I created the Southern Economic Advancement Project, which is a 501c3 sponsored project that is a think tank. We work on translating progressive policy into Southern to provide support to 12 Southern states. That's what I do.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I asked for the bona fides and I definitely got them. But let's focus now on Fair Fight Action, because that changed the course of like US and people sometimes say world history. In the process, you got nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, maybe even an Academy Award. You're on the short list. But I know that a lot of this came from disappointment when something that you refer to as the 8th stage of grief. So as a good entrepreneur, you turned lemon into veuve. How did you pivot from the disappointment of 2018 into the triumph of 2020 and 2021? What did you learn about yourself as an entrepreneur? And what do you think you can share with other entrepreneurs?
I mean, first of all, like most entrepreneurs, I'd had experience in not getting what I was seeking and not being successful. And sometimes it's because of our own shortcomings, and other times it's systemic. I would argue that while I was not entitled to win the 2018 election, having the Secretary of State, my opponent in the election, manage the process and be in charge of the election, and given some of the very egregious voter suppression tactics that he employed during his time as both Secretary of State and as a candidate, it calls into question the legitimacy of that election. But what I have to remember, and what I try to espouse, is that regardless of the reason why, the outcome was the same. And my responsibility in the wake of not winning that election was to think about what I'd done every other time I tried and not succeeded. Sometimes I tried and failed, and sometimes it's simply the timing wasn't right. And it's important to situate yourself in which thing is happening. So often when we aren't successful, we either internalize all of the fault and make it all about us, or we externalize all of the circumstances and say, well, it's not me, it was them. I think it's really critical that we evaluate both, and we make sure we understand what we could have done differently and better, but that we also we attribute the right amount of, not blame, but certainly the right amount of information to all of those other pieces, because if you don't do that work, you are doomed to repeat it. And so in 2018, when I did not become governor, it was the most significant loss that I had ever experienced in the sort of non-personal realm. And what was even more problematic was it was very public. In 2018, I was the most Googled politician in the world. And that meant that I didn't just not win. Everybody who cared knew I didn't win, and people who didn't care knew I didn't win. And so I gave myself, first of all, just space to grieve. There were 10 days in between election day and the day I did my non-concession speech. And as you said, I went through the stages of grief, and I was intentional about it. Because if you don't let yourself go through those stages, if you don't process it, then the piece that you skip over is going to reemerge at the least opportune time. And so I made certain I went through letting myself be sad, bargaining, and I really enjoyed anger a lot. I came back to that stage a couple of times, but in the end, as you pointed out, I created what I called the 8th stage, which is plotting. And that really is the entrepreneurial spirit. When things are broken, when things don't work, once you've assessed what happened, the next opportunity is to figure out how do you make certain that doesn't happen again. I had no right to be governor. And in my mind, launching a campaign or lawsuits to make myself governor would have undermined everything I'd argued to the people when I asked for their vote. What was the most responsible and responsive thing for me to do was to figure out, how do I fix the system that I think is broken? Voter suppression precluded thousands of Georgians from being able to cast their ballots or have their ballots counted or even get onto the voting rolls. And so my responsibility then was to create an infrastructure, create an entity that could solve that problem, address that systemic need. And that was Fair Fight Action. We later expanded it to include a PAC. And through the PAC, we created Fair Fight 2020, which operated in 20 states between August of 2019 and the 2020 elections.
Well, I mean, and we saw the result of that. But I guess throughout the entire process, you also faced a lot of personal attacks, a lot of them really focused on your phenotype, and not just from Republicans. And I read this one interview that you did in Nylon, and I'm going to quote you, where you said, "I'm not going to change my hair," which a consultant suggested I do. "I was not going to fake a boyfriend. If I find him, great, but I wasn't going to pretend that he existed or create some notion of a relationship. I wasn't going to wait until there was a more opportune moment for someone with my complexion," which was also a suggestion. "I refuse to let someone tell me that I am less than because they think my body is more than me. My sense of self is grounded in the fact that I work to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. I've spent a lot of time worrying about who I was in comparison to those around." And recently, in a lot of different contexts, a lot of Black female founders, for example, have been telling me that they feel like they don't get funded if they're not biracial or light-skinned Black women. I'm also going to point out that America's two top Black elected political officials, at least to this date, have been President Obama and Kamala Harris, both biracial. Do you think that the world is ready for Black women who don't look like Halle Berry? And how did you overcome that?
I think the world is ready when we force the conversation. But sometimes forcing the conversation means you've got to confront the reality that it's harder than you would imagine. Yeah, I'm a heavy set Black woman with very, very dark, not terribly dark, but I'm a Black woman. I'm obviously Black and I have natural hair. I have a gap between my teeth that also apparently offends many people. Which is actually the legacy of the fact that I grew up working poor. My parents couldn't afford orthodontia. And by the time I could afford it, I didn't want to erase my mother's gap and my grandmother's gap. It is part of who I am. And so I think part of the challenge in entrepreneurship, in politics, in life, I recently had this conversation. We did a piece with Viola Davis for Variety. We can only be who we are, but we have to be absolutely determined to acknowledge the challenges we face. During the 2020 cycle, when there was a conversation about who would be selected as vice president, there was a lot of castigation of my confidence and the fact that I shouldn't have been so assertive. And this is all to me of a piece. I not only have the responsibility to myself to stand up for the things I believe in and fight for the things I want, I have to remember that there's another heavyset Black girl with a chocolate complexion who is watching me and deciding whether she should even bother trying. And race matters, gender matters, color, unfortunately, continues to matter within racial bias. I can't stop people from being who they are, but I can stop myself from believing what they say. And what I would say, I don't want to diminish the opportunities for those who are biracial, those who are, because of the legacy of slavery and rape, are of a lighter complexion than myself. But my responsibility is to never let the existence of others diminish the legitimacy of my ambition and the legitimacy of my efforts. But more than that, we have to talk about it. We have to be intentional about confronting these, because the sins that live the longest are the ones that hide in the shadows. And until we are willing to confront it, especially those of us who have managed to make it through the gate or through the door, one of the other things I'm very proud of is that my responsibility is to get through that door, take it off of its hinges, and send out an SOS to everyone else so they can come on through. And we've got to do that, especially if you enjoy a privilege based on race, based on gender, based on access. And we've got to remember, especially in the entrepreneurial space, that those opportunities are so rare that our obligation is manifold.
Awesome. I agree with that. And, you know, your self-belief is, I think, kind of like the driving force. The question I have next is that, startup life is a roller coaster, but you've always had really clear what you wanted to do. I mean, I read that you had been planning this for at least 10 years. Some would say longer, but at least 10 years you're planning Georgia. But then on January 6th, while you should have been celebrating the results of this planning, there was this white supremacist insurrection. How did you deal with that on January 6th? I mean, on the one hand, 10 years of hard work had finally come to fruition. On the other hand, it seems like people wanted to try and undo it by attacking the US Capitol. For me, it was shocking, frankly, embarrassing to watch, especially as an American living outside of America, to see democracy be vandalized in this way. But were you surprised? And how did you deal with it on that day? Does this change your sense as to what your mission is, or did it just reinforce it?
Yeah, I'll start with the emotions. I was despondent. I was disgusted. I was not surprised. I grew up in Mississippi, a state where they flew the Confederate battle emblem as the entirety of our state flag. And it was not a relic of the Civil War. It was put up in response to Brown v. Board of Education, in response to the notion of educating Black children. The state of Mississippi decided that it would hold up this emblem that existed because of an attempt to keep my people, my ancestors, enslaved. And you could not walk into a courthouse or a schoolroom. You could not enter a public building without being confronted with the white supremacist nationalistic notion that was the Confederacy for all of my childhood. Because when we moved to Georgia, it wasn't the entirety of the flag, but it was most of the flag. And so my response has always been to, one, deny it its agency over me. And as some of you know, when I was in college, I actually got a permit and burned the flag in protest because I wanted to call attention to just how egregious it was that I was expected to be an active and engaged participant in a system that still flew an emblem of my demise. And so I would say it's more about, when I watched what happened, I was thinking about the fact that, yes, that's the reaction to change. Yes, that's the reaction to the election, not only of Joe Biden, but of Kamala Harris and of what she represented. Yes, it's the reaction to electing a Jewish senator from Georgia and a Black senator from Georgia, both for the first time. But it was also a vestige of what has been permeating and has winnowed its way through this country for generations, which is this tacit acceptance that racism and bigotry and supremacy, but also this nationalistic notion that if I can't have what I want, we can't have anything, that has been allowed to not only percolate, but was actually encouraged by the President of the United States. There is something deeply wrong when our democracy can be challenged in such a way, in such a public fashion, and we still do not have universal condemnation from those who claim to be patriots. And so I continue to be not surprised, but it's never going to undermine my commitment because this is my country and I believe that I am a patriot. It's why I fight for democracy, not fighting for Democrats. I fight for democracy because when you break democracy, no matter who your target is, everyone suffers. And so when I fight for access to the right to vote, I don't get to choose who gets to use that. And I'm doing my best work and I am being my best citizenship self when I am doing work that doesn't embolden those who hate, but encourages those who live here to protect who we are and to strive to be more than we are today.
And I mean, I think that, one of the things that you've done really well is kind of creating the sense of community, and a community that loves you, but also loves each other. And you've written, quote, "The most effective organizing for political revolution answers the question, how do we make change? First, you need a resonant issue to organize around. Then you need a concrete goal to organize toward." What are your tips for creating effective community organization, right? Because I think a lot of startups think that they're doing it, whether they're Facebook or Clubhouse these days or whatever. It's really hard to figure out what the right issue is and the right goal. So how do you do this? And my kind of Yale Law School inside question is, how do you do this without becoming Josh Hawley? How do you do it by making sure that you stay true to the community and not to your own self-aggrandizement?
Well, the first question is, what do you define as community? Who do you see yourself in league with, in communion with, in solidarity with. If those answers embarrass you, or if you have to justify and excuse them, they probably aren't the people you should be hanging around with. And so whether you're starting a community organization or you're starting a company that's seeking to serve a community, your responsibility is to understand the contours of that community and to really do the deep dive of saying it's not just a superficial set of metrics, but it's a core understanding of who they are, what they need, and why my product, why my personage has to be a part of it. And then the towards becomes the next piece, which is it's not enough to start a company simply to solve a problem. You've got to anticipate what happens when the problem is solved. Why do you continue to need to exist? And I think for a lot of startups, it becomes a difficult transition to figure that part out, because if you don't know who you're serving and why, figuring out what you do when their first level needs are met, what do you do for that second level of need? And whether I'm starting a nonprofit or a for-profit, that's the conversation I always have to have. When we launched Nourish, I had no skin in the game, I thought. My business partner, Laura, had a 1-year-old, or I guess he was 6 months old. She was trying to feed him. She was trying to juggle. We were literally sitting in a restaurant. She's juggling him and he kicks the bottle and she has to convince a waiter to take it in the back and wash it off because it's the only bottle she has with her. And one of the reasons he was able to kick it was that she was trying to, add the formula, shake and get ready. And so she bemoaned, she's like, I wish there was a Dasani for babies. And when she said that, we started thinking about it and talking about what's this universe of people who need this bottled water for babies and toddlers. We began with her and with working mothers, but a few weeks later, I actually had my niece. She was an infant. She was a little bit older than Connor's age. And I had her for a few hours because her parents had to go off. And she kicked over the entire can of Infamil they left with me. And in that moment, I realized I may not be a parent, but I became part of the community of need. And yes, it would have been so great if they just dropped off, Faith and a couple of bottles of Nourish when all I had to do was just add the formula and not try to arrange and, fill and go. And so anyway, that's a very long way of saying we can't presume we understand community unless we investigate, but that investigation has to be more than superficial, and that investigation has to be authentic. And if we find in that investigation there are parts of that community that are distasteful or worse, are hateful, we have an affirmative responsibility to confront that, not to cower and not to capitulate, but to push back. And I think that's the distinction between where I would say I've situated myself and where Josh Hawley finds himself.
And I guess a kind of, direct corollary to that is the messaging bit, because you said in a recent New York Times article with Lauren, too often Democrats try to ensure that their communications include everyone and everything. If your political identity is so inchoate as to be meaningless, you never gain the ability to persuade other people to join you. That is not how you win elections. And I guess that's not how you win markets either. If people don't know what you stand for, it's really difficult to understand. So do you have any tips for how to do effective messaging, positioning, and differentiation? You've had to kind of position yourself and come up with the right message. Tell us a little bit about how you've done that.
I begin by trying to think of the broadest philosophy, but then winnow it down to the sharpest and most narrow way to describe it. So when I was Democratic leader, people don't usually think of that as an entrepreneurial job, but my job as the leader, I was the leader of the Democratic caucus. And I took that job on at a time when we were at our lowest ebb. I mentioned this in the article that I wrote with Lauren Growargo, who was my former campaign manager and the CEO of Fair Fight. But when I became leader, we had lost every statewide office. We were a few votes away from just essentially irrelevancy. And my responsibility was to figure out how do we create a message that the 60 plus members of the caucus could all hold on to. And so I had to be broad enough to capture everyone, but clear enough that people understood what we were talking about. And so it became the reductive part was, okay, everyone cares about the economy, everyone cares about education, everyone cares about healthcare. But then it's figuring out how do you take those words and reduce it to something that if you're not there to explain it, people will automatically and instinctively understand what you intend. And if your message is so vague that they can invest and put into it anything they want, then you're in trouble. Because when other people are making your message for you, you're not only not controlling your message, you're going to lose control of your product. And so part of it is finding out the broadest set of philosophies, but narrowing it down to the most salient and accessible examples. I was talking with someone yesterday who's thinking about running for office, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to talk about transparency and accountability." I'm like, what does that mean to a voter? Transparent about what? Accountable to whom? We can't get stuck on buzzwords without doing the exploration and the hard work of saying, what does it look like if we succeed? Transparency where? Accountability how? And whether you're starting, when we were doing Nourish, we had to figure out, how do you describe the need for a bottle of water for babies and toddlers? Or with Now Account, how do you describe how do you get why you need to monetize your invoices by allowing us to buy it from you in a non-factor relationship? Well, we said, get your money now. That's actually how the name came, because we took the broadest goal, which was monetizing invoices and B2B transactions in non-recourse fashion, but it became get your money now. And we were able to say to B2Bs, to small businesses, we can help you get your money now. And we could then talk to them about the invoices and the process. But that big macro construct had to become a very simple, understandable message.
No, awesome. And I guess it's worked because now you're a global celebrity, you're a brand. Maybe 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. And I guess a lot of people were like, well, how do I create a brand like how Stacey did it that inspires people and that opens up a lot of doors? And how do you deal with the challenge that your brand might become even bigger than the original organization or the original cause? So tell us like the secret. How do you become the next Stacey Abrams? How do I develop a brand like how you did it?
Number one, I didn't plan any of this. Part of what happened was I had a massive failure live on every channel. So people kind of got to know me. But it was also about the fact that they could link my story to their own experiences. And for those who'd never experienced voter suppression, they could understand the unfairness of the situation, or they could understand my passion for access to democracy. And so the first responsibility was to always not create a messianic complex around who I was. When I ran for governor, when we did our first round of sending out field operatives to go knock on doors, they didn't tell people I was running for governor. They did the work of asking people what they needed and explaining what a governor does. That was intentional on my part and Lauren's part, because as much as I'm the name on the ballot, people are electing a set of principles, values, and ideas, and they're hoping that those get translated into policies and actions. And the minute it becomes a messianic approach, when your company is all about who you are, then you're in a lot of trouble, because the first time you make a mistake, every problem that you have becomes the problem of the company, whether it's true or not. When the sort of lauding started happening after the November elections, when people started thanking me for, how we worked on the election, I was very intentional about saying it was broader than just me, because the second challenge is, if you don't support those who help make your company possible, even if it's just the person who picks up your mail or the assistant who makes sure that you return the phone call from the VC that needs one more piece of paper before you get chucked out of the competition, you've got to make certain that you're always supporting and lifting up everyone who is a part of it. And so I'm very intentional about always lauding those who did the work, especially those who are the most often overlooked and ignored. And particularly for people of color, we are often the support staff for success, but we are never the beneficiaries of gratitude. And so my responsibility, especially given the construct of what we had to do here in Georgia, was to always lift up not only communities of color, but be specific about who did what, and not isolate it and say that only one community was the solution, because that's never true. If every Black person in Georgia voted, we would have lost that election. That Black people were the majority of the vote, but it also took Latino and AAPI and young people. Native Americans turned out in the runoff elections in ways that we didn't anticipate, but we worked towards. And we had white voters. And so it's always also necessary to, yes, thank those who are core, but expand out the notion of who is involved, because you never know when you're going to need their support again. And then the last thing is, don't take yourself so seriously. I've met me. I like me, but I'm not overly impressed. I know who I am. I know who I was the day before anybody cared. And I didn't suddenly become a new person when folks realized the work that I've been doing. And so remaining not just grounded, but remaining honest with yourself. I'm going to screw up something. I'm going to try for something and it's not going to work. And I don't get to do that behind the cloak of darkness anymore. And so I've got to be prepared to be in the light by being as authentic as I can be, whether people are watching me or not. But when you do that, I think what happens is that people start to see that they have a stake in it as well, and they're more willing to give, and they're also more willing to forgive when you create space for others to be a part of what you're creating.
No, and I think that's awesome. One of the questions, which you've already answered it, is that you always say Lauren is your partner in crime, giving her a lot of credit. So you've also built up like very loyal teams. One thing I was going to ask as a follow-up to what you just said, though, is President Biden has set up an agency, or said he's going to set up an agency to support Black and Brown entrepreneurs in particular. Likewise, New York City, my hometown, has launched a program called Black Entrepreneurs New York City, BENYC, or BNYC, to specifically support Black founders. Because what they said is, quote, entrepreneurship has provided a pathway to wealth generation for Black families for centuries, yet Black entrepreneurs face enormous barriers and are vastly underrepresented among New York City's business owners. While the Black community currently makes up 22% of New York City's population, just 3.5% of New York City businesses are owned by Black entrepreneurs. And the Federal Reserve has also said Black people are overwhelmingly affected by COVID. Do you think that government should have programs like what New York City is doing specifically for Black businesses, or is that somehow divisive?
No, it's absolutely, it is divisive, but it's also absolutely necessary. I live in the South. That is where I focus much of my attention, although the work I do, I always try to make sure it's exportable across the country. So Fair Fight operated not just in the South, but we were in Wisconsin and Arizona, we were in Pennsylvania and in Michigan. So we were national in our ethos, but we were grounded in the experience of being in the South. The same thing was true for Fair Count. The same thing is true to a lesser extent for SEEP. But my hope is the work we do here can be exported to other places. I say all that to say this. The disproportionate harm visited upon Black communities based on centuries of legal segregation, but also legal isolation from opportunity, did not end with the Civil War. It did not end with the Voting Rights Act. It did not end with the Civil Rights Act. And in some places, it continues. When you can't get access to a bond to bid on a contract because you can't access the resources, or because the companies that do the bonding traditionally don't bond Black communities, Black owners, then you are isolated from the process. But there were also legal impediments to housing, to banking, that have become illegal in de jure, but as you know, de jure and de facto are very different. And so, yes, there's an affirmative obligation. And yes, I'm using affirmative intentionally. There is an affirmative obligation for government to try to restore what it stole with centuries of legal division and legal divisiveness. And so if there are those who will be angered by that access, I appreciate their concerns, but I am going to be an advocate for that investment, because the communities that built this country should benefit from their work. And even if it is generationally delayed, the new generations that had to inherit the lack of wealth and the lack of access and the lack of opportunity deserve the investment now. There is not another situation where we would say that the progenitor does not have the right to leave the inheritance to the successor. And the same thing should be true for supporting Black entrepreneurs. We should be able to access that which was denied to so many who came before us.
Amen. So my last 4 questions, because we have 6 minutes. What's it like to hang out with famous people? Because you've been very effective in deploying celebrities, such as in your the Runoff concert with Kerry Washington, Justin Timberlake, John Legend. I watched it. You campaigned with Oprah and Obama. Edward Norton is among your 2.5 million duly enamored Twitter followers. Even Viola Davis was saying she was afraid to meet you. So what role have influencers and celebrities played in helping you to get your message out? And what are your tips for other founders that might be trying to engage with celebrities as a tool of disseminating their message?
So again, I am a fangirl often when I meet them. I apologize in advance. Um, I'm like this close to stalking some of them, but I've trained myself. But the reality is they are engaged in part because of the work and because of the product, because of the goal. In voting, that we've heard the sort of this discounting of celebrity involvement in voting, which is absolute bollocks, because the reality is they're citizens. They have the right to be heard, but more than that, they can often cut through the just disinterest that is often focused on politics, because when they talk about it, they can frame it in ways that are it's more accessible. And my mission is not to have people listen to me, it's having people understand the goal, and whoever the best messenger for that is, that's who I want. And so for others who have that access or opportunity, it should never be I want this person associated with my product because they're famous. It's I want this person associated because they have the ability to cut through the disinterest or cut through the noise and bring attention. But the three things I always try to do, one is always be intentional about my ask and limited in my requests. Two, to be as thoughtful about how much of their time and what the return will look like. And then three, to be as grateful as possible in real ways. And so it's not just, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, but it's what can I do for you? Do you have a group that you support that what I do can be helpful to? So finding a way not to be transactional, but to be reciprocal. And that I think has been very helpful over time, because I do my best to reciprocate and to ensure that our team is always reciprocal, that we ask how we can help as much as we're asking them to help.
Awesome. So last three questions. 2020 was an annus horribilis. You've helped to make 2021 better by getting some changes. The vaccines definitely helped as well. What are you trying to do in 2021? What are your KPIs, personally and professionally?
Fair fight. We are now facing more than 253 bills that are being introduced, and they've been introduced in 42 states to claw back the right to vote, to reimpose voter suppression because too many people voted, according to these folks. And so we're fighting to make certain that not only do we block these bills across these 42 states, that we encourage Congress to pass H.R. 1, which will create a foundation for democracy in America, and H.R. 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Number two, Fair Count is going to continue to look at the census, which is not just a once in a decade intrusion in your privacy, but will determine the allocation of $1.5 trillion every year for the next 10 years, including to our schools, to our communities, but also political power, and making sure that redistricting, as it happens across this country, it's been delayed because of the just mismanagement and the perfidy that was performed by the Trump administration. It's being delayed by months, but we want to make certain that when it happens, that we are ensuring that every community that deserves to be included to get the resources that come with this, including communities of color, getting access to financial resources for startup businesses, that happens. And then third, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, what we're doing there is trying to build what we call South Strong, which is a COVID recovery plan that actually uses not just the relief bills, but the recovery plan that's going to be much more comprehensive to fix some of the broken pieces of the South, broken public health infrastructure and broken public benefits. And then personally, I've got 2 books coming out, a new fiction novel, or that was redundant, a new work of fiction called While Justice Sleeps will be out in May. It's my first legal thriller. And then the paperback version of my book, Our Time Is Now, is coming out in June. And so I'm going to be begging a lot of people to buy my books.
Yeah, and to vote for you for the Oscars. So last 2 questions. You mentioned the name Trump, and I'm going to say that you trumped Trump. You trumped Trump. Do you think that Trump, now that we can look back at him, was there anything that we can learn from him in terms of his skills as an entrepreneur or a marketer or a branding expert? And what do you feel about the fact that he tries to say that he was inspired by you for his non-concession?
Well, in the first, we can learn that authoritarianism is alive and well and democracy is fragile, and that we can be taken in by a charlatan and a huckster who used his skills not to be an entrepreneur, but to become an authoritarian populist who tried to destroy America. And there is absolutely no countenance between what I did and what he did. He fought to deny people the right to vote, to have their votes discounted and thrown out. And my fight was to ensure that every single vote was counted and that the systems of democracy work for all.
And last question, I know they're going to give me an extra 2 minutes. For any entrepreneur out there who says, I want to be the next Stacey Abrams, what are your 3 bits of advice for that young person or older person?
Number 1, don't edit your ambition. Believe as much as you can and reach as far as you can. But once you have that ambition, number 2, do the planning. The difference between a wish and an achievement is the work in between. And so do the work of actually figuring out how to get from where you are to where you want to be. And then number 3, when you fail or when you're afraid, know that failure isn't permanent and fear can be your friend. And by that, I mean, usually you're afraid for a reason. Understand what those reasons are and account for them, fix them. Because often what they're signaling to you is that there is something that you haven't considered that you need to be aware of and you need to work towards. And as for failure, as I've said, I've failed, I've not won, I've lost. I have done all of the different, idioms for not getting what you want. But sometimes not winning doesn't mean that you didn't do it right. It just means you've got to do it again and you've got to bring other people with you to get it done.
Awesome. Well, that's it. I think we're almost in time. You're always an inspiration. Good luck. I know now you're off to testify in front of Congress about the voting rights to protect all Americans. So thank you, Stacey. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Gary, it's always a delight to be with you. And thank you all, Carly, and thank you, Startup Grind, for having me.
Thank you.